Chapter 21, The Crumbling Gateway. Joss and Veyna reached the ruins of an ancient gateway hidden deep within the Emberwood. The massive stone arch was fractured, its once intricate carvings eroded by time. The whispers intensified, spiraling around them like a chorus of forgotten souls. Veyna knelt beside an inscription, tracing her fingers over the worn symbols. This was the threshold, the barrier that sealed the entity inside. It's failing. A deep tremor shook the ground, and a gust of wind roared through the trees, carrying with it a sense of impending doom. The entity was no longer merely watching, it was waking. If this gate falls, Joss said, everything we've done will be for nothing. We have to find a way to strengthen the seal. Veyna's expression was grim. We need the Keykeeper's fire. A sudden growl echoed through the ruins, and from the shadows emerged creatures unlike any they had seen before, distorted, twisted echoes of beings long lost to the Emberwood's curse. Their eyes burned with an unnatural light, and their voices melded into a single, harrowing shriek. Joss tightened his grip on his blade. Looks like they won't let us pass easily. The battle was unlike any before. The creatures moved like wraiths, their bodies shifting between substance and shadow. The lantern's glow flickered erratically, its light faltering against the creature's relentless assault. Veyna chanted words lost to time, her voice carrying an ancient power that sent arcs of energy spiraling through the air. The gateway trembled under the strain, and the very fabric of the forest seemed to waver between worlds. Joss fought with everything he had, but the creatures showed no sign of stopping. Then, in the heart of the battle, he noticed something. Each time the lantern's light pulsed, the creatures recoiled. Veyna! The lantern, it weakens them. She nodded, adjusting her stance. Then we use it to push them back. With renewed determination, they pressed forward. The lantern's glow flared brighter, and the creatures shrieked as they were driven back into the abyss. As the last of them vanished, a final tremor rocked the ruins. The gateway groaned, cracks widening. It won't hold much longer, Joss panted. We need that fire. Veyna wiped blood from her lip. Then we find the Keykeeper. And we do it fast. The Emberwood had given them their next trial, and time was running out. Chapter 22, The Keykeeper's Fire. Joss and Veyna raced through the Emberwood, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as the shadows twisted and curled around them. The ground trembled beneath their feet, the pulse of an awakening force vibrating through the roots and stones. Time was slipping away. The gate was failing, and the entity within was growing stronger with every passing moment. The Keykeeper's fire, Veyna repeated under her breath, determination stealing her voice. If we don't reach it in time, the seal will break completely. Joss clenched his fists. Then we run faster. They sprinted deeper into the forest, weaving between towering trees whose bark cracked and groaned as if whispering warnings. The lantern pulsed with an eerie light, its glow flickering in response to the encroaching darkness. Above them, the sky had darkened unnaturally, the storm from before now thick with ominous clouds. Then, through the tangled branches, they saw it, the ruins of an ancient altar, shrouded in mist. At its center stood a brazier, unlit and waiting. And beside it, hunched and silent, stood the Keykeeper. He was taller than any man, his form wrapped in a tattered cloak of woven fire and smoke. His face was obscured beneath the hood, save for two burning embers where his eyes should have been. The air around him shimmered with heat, yet the cold grip of dread still clung to Joss's skin. Veyna stepped forward cautiously. Keykeeper, she called, her voice steady but laced with urgency. The gate is crumbling. We need the fire to strengthen the seal. The Keykeeper did not move. Instead, a deep, guttural voice resonated from within the shadows of his hood. The fire is not given. It is earned. Joss tightened his grip on his dagger. Then tell us how. The Keykeeper extended an arm, and the shadows around the altar stirred. Shapes began to form, figures from the past, memories long buried in the heart of the Emberwood. Faces familiar and strange flickered into being, their hollow eyes fixed upon Joss and Veyna. Only those who face their greatest fear may claim the fire, the Keykeeper intoned. Step forward, and the trial shall begin. Joss exchanged a glance with Veyna. There was no hesitation in her gaze, only resolve. Together, they stepped into the circle of stone. The moment they crossed the threshold, darkness swallowed them whole. The trial. Joss found himself alone. The forest was gone, the Keykeeper gone, only endless black surrounded him, stretching in every direction. Then, a voice. Joss. He turned sharply. The voice was familiar, achingly so. A figure emerged from the shadows, a young girl with golden hair, her eyes wide with fear. His sister. Ela? Joss's voice cracked. No, this isn't real. But she stepped closer, her small hands trembling. You promised you'd find me, she whispered. You promised you wouldn't let me go. Guilt crashed over him like a wave. The memories he had buried, the night she disappeared, the night he had failed to protect her, came flooding back. He had searched the Emberwood for weeks, months, but she was never found. And now, here she was, standing before him. Joss swallowed hard. I did everything I could. Her expression darkened. Did you? The world around them shifted, and suddenly Joss was reliving that night. The storm. The frantic search. The whispering voices luring Ela away. He had been too slow. Too afraid. And now the shadows mocked him with the past. No, he said through clenched teeth. This is a trick. The illusion of Ela smiled, but her eyes were hollow. The shadows behind her swirled, reaching for him. Joss took a step back, but then stopped. No. He wouldn't run. He wouldn't let fear control him again. With a steady breath, he reached forward and gripped Ela's hand, only to feel it dissolve into nothing. The illusion shattered like glass, and the darkness recoiled. Veyna's trial. Veyna stood frozen in place, her own trial unfolding before her. A tall figure loomed before her, cloaked in black armor, his face hidden beneath an iron mask. You cannot escape what you are, the figure said, his voice like distant thunder. You wear the name of a hero, but you are nothing but a curse. Veyna's hands curled into fists. I am not my past. The figure stepped closer, the air growing colder. Then why do the dead still call your name? Whispers filled the air, ghostly and accusing. Veyna could see them, shadows of the people she had failed, the ones lost because of her choices. Their eyes bore into her, filled with blame. The figure raised a sword, its blade shimmering with a cold, blue light. Will you fight me, knowing that you carry their weight? Veyna's heart pounded. She had spent years running from this moment, from her past. But she would run no longer. With a defiant roar, she lunged forward. The blade came down, but she did not flinch. The moment she embraced her truth, that she was both light and shadow, savior and destroyer, the illusion shattered. She gasped, stumbling back into reality. The Keeper's fire. Joss and Veyna found themselves back in the stone circle. The Keykeeper stood before them, silent and watching. You have faced your fears, he said. And so, you are worthy. With a slow gesture, he extended his hands, and from his palms, a single flame ignited, a brilliant, golden ember that pulsed with power. This fire will seal the gate, he said. But beware, once taken, it will burn within you. Its power is not easily tamed. Joss looked to Veyna, then back at the flame. They had no choice. Together, they stepped forward, and as they did, the fire leapt into their hands. It did not burn, yet they could feel its heat searing into their very souls. The trial was over. But the final battle had just begun. Chapter 23, Flames in the Dark. The fire burned in their hands, not with heat, but with a pulsing, living energy. Joss could feel it thrumming through his veins, its presence both empowering and unsettling. Veyna clenched her fists around the ember's glow, her breath steady despite the weight of what they now carried. The fire is ours, she said, turning to the Keykeeper. Now tell us, how do we use it? The towering figure regarded them in silence before raising a single hand. The moment his fingers moved, the air around them trembled, and the mist at their feet parted to reveal a winding path of stone leading into the heart of the Emberwood. "The path is open," the Keykeeper intoned. "But you must walk it alone. The fire is both a weapon and a burden. It will show you the way, but it will also test you." Joss nodded. "Then we'd better start walking." Veyna turned her eyes to the darkened sky above, where the storm clouds continued to swirl. "We don't have much time." Together, they set off into the unknown. The shadows stir. The deeper they walked into the forest, the heavier the air became. The trees whispered in hushed, broken voices, their words just out of reach. The fire in their hands flickered and pulsed, illuminating the narrow path ahead. Then, a sound, a low, guttural growl. Joss and Veyna froze. From the shadows beyond the trees, figures emerged, twisted, half-formed creatures with hollow eyes and elongated limbs. They moved unnaturally, shifting between solid and shadow with each step. "The Watchers," Veyna whispered, tightening her grip on her blade. Joss raised the fire in his palm. The moment the light touched the creatures, they recoiled, their forms twisting as if in pain. "They fear it," he murmured. "But they won't retreat." The creatures began to circle, their movement slow, calculating. The largest among them let out a rasping, ear-piercing shriek, and in an instant, they lunged. A battle of fire and shadows. Joss reacted on instinct, thrusting the ember's glow forward. The fire flared, sending a golden arc of light through the darkness. One of the creatures shrieked as the flames licked its form, dissolving it into nothing. Veyna spun, slicing through another, her blade meeting no resistance, until she willed the fire into her strike. The moment the ember's light touched the metal, the blade ignited, burning with a brilliance that cut through the shadows. "They can't be killed by steel alone," she said, dodging an incoming strike. "But the fire burns them out," Joss finished. They fought back to back, wielding the fire as both shield and weapon. The creatures hissed and howled, their forms flickering between existence and oblivion. But there were too many. For every shadow they banished, two more took its place. "We need to end this now," Veyna said, glancing toward the path ahead. Joss nodded. With a deep breath, he focused, letting the ember's energy surge through him. He raised his hand high, and the fire responded, flaring outward in a brilliant explosion of golden light. The creatures shrieked one final time before they were consumed. The forest fell silent. Joss exhaled, his hands trembling. The fire in his palm dimmed, but its presence remained, warm and pulsing. Veyna sheathed her blade. "The closer we get, the stronger they become." Joss looked toward the dark horizon. "Then we keep moving." With the path now clear, they pressed forward, deeper into the Emberwood, toward the final battle awaiting them at the crumbling gate. The fire had chosen them. But whether it would save them, or consume them, remained to be seen. Chapter 24: The Echoes of the Fallen. Joss and Veyna pressed forward, the ember's glow flickering like a heartbeat in the darkness. The forest around them had grown eerily silent, no whispers, no rustling leaves, only the distant rumble of the storm that loomed above. "The air feels wrong," Joss muttered, gripping the lantern tighter. Veyna nodded. "It's watching us." They reached the edge of a clearing where the ground dipped into a vast hollow. Stone pillars jutted out like broken ribs, remnants of an ancient structure long since devoured by time. At the center of the ruin stood an altar, cracked and worn, and surrounding it were figures, dozens of them, motionless, half buried in the earth. Joss took a hesitant step forward. "Are they statues?" Veyna's face darkened. "No. They were people. The buried ones." The realization settled over them like a weight. The figures weren't crafted from stone, they were petrified in place, their features frozen in expressions of terror and despair. Some reached skyward, mouths agape in silent screams. Others clutched at their chests, as if in pain. "The Emberwood's curse," Veyna murmured. "These are the ones who came before us." Joss knelt beside one of the figures, a warrior, his sword half raised. His armor was cracked and brittle, his eyes wide with fear. "How did this happen?" A sudden gust of wind howled through the clearing, and the whispers returned, low at first, then rising to a deafening cacophony. The petrified figures began to tremble, dust falling from their forms. "They're waking up," Veyna warned. The first to move was the warrior. His body cracked as it shifted, joints stiff with centuries of stillness. His eyes, once hollow, now burned with an eerie, golden light. One by one, the others followed. Joss backed away. "I don't think they're happy to see us." A fight against time. The buried ones turned their glowing eyes on them, their movement slow at first, but then, all at once, they lunged. Joss barely had time to react before a petrified soldier swung a rusted blade toward him. He ducked, rolling aside as the sword slammed into the ground, cracking the stone beneath it. Veyna met her attacker head-on, her blade igniting with ember fire as it clashed against ancient steel. "They're strong," she gritted out, pushing back against the weight of her opponent. "Too strong." Joss raised the lantern high. Its glow pulsed, but instead of repelling the creatures, they hesitated, staring at the light as if recognizing it. "They remember," he whispered. The warrior who had first moved stepped forward, locking eyes with Joss. His face was lined with cracks, but his expression was no longer one of rage, it was sorrow. He opened his mouth, and a dry, rasping voice emerged. "Free us." Joss' breath caught in his throat. "What?" Veyna kicked back one of the attackers and turned. "What did it say?" The warrior raised a shaking hand, pointing toward the altar. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them like a storm. "They're not trying to stop us," Joss realized. "They want release." But not all of them. Some still fought, driven mad by centuries of torment. The air crackled with tension as the last of the frenzied warriors surged forward. Joss didn't hesitate. He focused on the fire in his palm and threw it outward, sending a wave of golden light through the clearing. The buried ones caught in its path let out shuddering gasps as their forms crumbled, not in pain, but in relief. The warrior at the altar remained. He looked down at his hands, the cracks in his skin deepening, then met Joss's gaze one last time. "Go," he rasped. "End it." And then, he too, was gone. The path forward. The clearing was silent once more. The storm overhead rumbled, and the ember in Joss's hand burned brighter. Veyna exhaled, lowering her blade. They were trapped here. All this time. Joss nodded, clenching his fists. And whatever did this is still waiting ahead. Beyond the altar, the path continued, twisting through the ruins toward the final threshold. The air was thick with energy, pulsing like a living thing. They had freed the fallen. But now, the true battle awaited. Joss took the first step forward. No more running. Chapter 25, The Veil of Ash. Joss and Veyna stepped past the last of the fallen warriors, their forms now little more than dust swept away by the restless wind. The ruined altar behind them seemed to exhale, its burden lightened by the souls they had freed. Yet the path ahead was darker, choked with mist that clung to the trees like a shroud. The lantern's glow barely cut through the gloom, and the air carried the scent of burning wood, though no flames were in sight. "We're close," Veyna murmured. Joss could feel it too. The Emberwood had been shifting ever since they had entered, the trees bending unnaturally, the whispers growing more urgent. It was as if the forest itself was leading them somewhere, or forcing them toward the inevitable. A distant howl echoed through the trees. Not the spectral wolves they had encountered before, this was something deeper, a guttural sound that made the hairs on the back of Joss's neck rise. Veyna gripped the hilt of her blade. "We're being hunted." The Valley of Cinders. The path wound down into a valley where the trees gave way to something else, blackened remains of structures, charred and skeletal, half sunken into the earth. Joss's boots crunched over brittle, burnt wood as they advanced. It took him a moment to realize what he was walking on. "Bones," he whispered, swallowing hard. This was a village. Veyna knelt, running her fingers over a scorched carving half buried in the ash. Not just any village. This was the Keykeeper's domain. Joss turned sharply. Then the fire wasn't natural, she finished. It was set. The implications were heavy. Someone, or something, had burned this place to the ground. If the Keykeeper had once lived here, there was no sign of them now. Only silence remained, thick as the mist that called between the ruins. Then, from the shadows, came movement. The Ashbourne. Figures emerged, their bodies wreathed in cinders, their eyes hollow voids of fire and smoke. Their flesh was cracked, ashen, as though they had been burned alive but refused to perish. Joss took an instinctive step back, gripping the lantern tighter. "Survivors?" he asked. "No," Veyna said. "Remnants." One of the figures stepped forward, its head tilting as if studying them. When it spoke, its voice was a rasp, like air forced through embers. "You seek the Keykeeper?" Joss hesitated. "Yes." The figure's burned lips curled into something like a smile. "Then you must prove your worth." Without warning, the Ashbourne lunged. Joss barely managed to throw himself aside as claws swiped through the space he had just occupied. Veyna reacted faster, drawing her sword and meeting the next attack with a sharp clang of steel. Sparks flew, illuminating the ashen figures for the briefest moment. "They're fast!" Joss shouted, dodging another strike. "And relentless," Veyna added, gritting her teeth as she parried a second attacker. Joss held up the lantern, hoping its light would have the same effect as before. The glow pulsed, and for a moment, the Ashbourne hesitated, but only for a moment. Then they came again, unfazed. "They don't fear the lantern," Joss realized, stepping back. Veyna cursed under her breath. "Then we need another way to stop them." Trial of the flame. The Ashbourne surrounded them, circling like predators. Joss felt something stir in the back of his mind, a pull, faint but insistent. His fingers curled around the lantern's handle. Then the voice returned. Not from the Ashbourne. Not from Veyna. But from the forest itself. The fire must be earned. A sudden pain lanced through Joss's skull, and he stumbled. The world flickered, then changed. He was no longer in the valley. Instead, he stood in the midst of flames, an inferno stretching to the sky. The air was thick with smoke, and before him knelt a lone figure, bound in chains. The Keykeeper. Their face was obscured, but their voice carried through the blaze. "Will you take the fire, or will you let it consume you?" Joss's hands burned. The lantern in his grip was no longer metal, but molten, shifting between light and shadow. He could feel its power thrumming, wild and untamed. The voice came again. "Prove yourself." The Ashbourne surged forward in reality, and Joss snapped back just in time to act. The Keeper's judgment. Joss no longer hesitated. He thrust the lantern forward, not as a source of light, but as a weapon. The flames within it roared, expanding outward in a brilliant arc. The Ashbourne recoiled, not in fear, but in recognition. You were the first, Joss realized. The ones who carried the fire before. The lead Ashbourne's hollow gaze met his. And now you carry it. The flames in Joss's hands shifted, growing brighter. The valley trembled, the ruins shaking as if something had been waiting for this moment. The Ashbourne, one by one, sank to their knees. The fire had chosen its bearer. Veyna, breathing heavily, lowered her sword. "Joss, what did you do?" He wasn't sure. All he knew was that the power now surged within him, no longer distant, no longer locked away. The whispers in the Emberwood fell silent. The path forward had been decided.